It's been a bit since a series made my head hurt. That's now changed with the Korean Netflix crime thriller A Killer Paradox. This is twisty and sometimes confusing, but is it any good? Flailing at life, a listless young man named Lee Tang panics after he kills a man following work. Soon, Detective Nan-gam is on the case, discovering a disturbing truth about the victim. Alright, so this is an 8-episode show that's going to take a chunk of time to get through thanks to the nearly hour-long episodes. And I'm not going to go into detail on a lot of things because there are some complications and mysteries that need to be experienced as they happen. But like the synopsis stated, we follow this young man named Lee Tang. He sort of goes to school, but not often, so now he's not doing too well on that front. He has exited his mandatory military service, and he now works at a convenience store, which he hates. Choi Woo-sik does an excellent job at just selling his lack of enthusiasm for work, and then really life. I mean, he mopes and he just shuffles through life, aimless, pretty depressed too. But one night after work, he accidentally gets into a fight and ends up killing a dude. Now from there, a detective begins the case, but also uncovers something very surprising about the victim. Now this whole show, it's kinda hard to follow. The storyline, it's convoluted and complex, but that's not what makes it difficult to stay with. The visuals, they're just constantly shifting. So sometimes we'll be watching Lee Tang, and then the scene will transition into a flashback, or maybe a premonition, or some imaginative rabbit hole. Now the timeline becomes very vague, and much like just a big bowl of spaghetti. Now I know that sounds like that is just a massive negative, right? But it's not. It can be a detractor from engaging with the story, but the overall plot lines, I think they can be followed. So even if you do get a bit mixed up at what's really happening in front of you, the narrative itself is pretty linear. And something that absolutely shines in this series is the editing. As we are morphing between timelines, or maybe you call them experiences, the transitions are flawless. They seamlessly move us from one area or time to another, and that's also what then helps to make this visually confusing. I mean, I still count it as a major positive for the storytelling, even though it can sound like it just made the whole thing messy. Now, the pursuit aspect of the story, it's urgent and engaging, filled with enough complexities to keep this from becoming static. And while there are plot conveniences that are built in, they don't stand out as bothersome because of just how that narrative unfolds. Yes, that's a bit vague, but again, I don't want to give any details specific to this portion of the story. Just know that Lee Tang enjoys some plot protection to keep the chase moving. Now, about halfway through the season, there's sort of a narrative shift that feels like the show almost abandons what it had been setting up prior. But I think it just gains more focus. I mean, it's narrowing down the side quests and then the potential distractions so that the last several episodes, they contain a lot of urgency and anxiety. Now, in the first half of the story, there are areas that sort of go off on tangents that end up feeling unnecessary. I mean, time is spent with characters or objects that don't ultimately lead anywhere, and they end up just adding time to the story rather than progressing it forward. While watching it though, it's hard to know what isn't going to help the story in the long run and what will. So at least the watching experience, it doesn't feel futile or time wasting. It's just afterwards that you can begin to wonder why we were spending time following X when it just didn't amount to much. Now, for as complex as the story can become, I appreciate the twists and the drawn-out suspense of the plot. Arcs interweave and crisscross, but they delay all the reveals. I mean, even as we get towards the end of the show, there are reveals upon reveals that then show how layered the story is and how, despite the mounting twists, the story, it makes sense and then it resolves to a satisfying conclusion. That's also something to note. I mean, while the story does wrap up, it also leaves a small window to continue if it needs to do that. I mean, I don't think a further story is necessary, but if they wanted to keep going, they could. Now, there's a lot of violence that is inherent to the narrative, but the show, it creatively doesn't showcase every vicious blow or stab. Typically, we're shown the beginning action, and then the scene usually shifts to the investigation portion of that violence. That's a good mix of action and then use of practical gore without having to always focus on the detailed brutality. And then those practical effects and the makeup, they are carried out very well. Some are even just a bit gag-inducing. Now for the characters, I appreciate that there's some dilemma that's introduced so that we're not always sure who exactly to root against. Now, there are some purely bad players, but some sort of ride that line, especially because of how charismatic they are. They endear themselves to us as the audience so that we can begin to feel a small sense of conflict. So, for me, to make this a near perfect series, I'd cut out the extraneous areas of the story that don't tend to lead anywhere and also don't fulfill any character or story progression. This would help to make the storytelling more efficient and taut, too. I'd also want to fix some of the confusion with visuals as the scenes transition us around with the character. I mean, I love the editing, and I wouldn't want to lose that creativity and style, but maybe make some elements a bit more clear as to where in time and space a character is. Outside of those, this series is confident in its complexities, using layered storytelling to build an enthralling mystery while also delivering intricately developed characters who create moral dilemmas based on their actions and their motives. And it's a time investment to binge, but it is ultimately worth it. There's sex, nudity, a lot of profanity, and then a ton of violence. I give A Killer Paradox 4 out of 5 couches. So are there any twisty or complex thrillers or mysteries that you love? Let me know about them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.